Hey, do you want to be rich and famous? Well, I can't teach you about that, but I can teach you how to make this. First off, you're going to need some wire. For this, you'll need some 18 gauge square. This is dead soft brass, and I'm using both brass and copper 20 gauge half round, both dead soft, but you don't have to use two different kinds of 20 gauge half round. I'm using two just because I like the contrast. And you'll obviously need your pliers. Okay, first cut 4 pieces of the 18 gauge square. I'm cutting mine at about 9 inches or 23 centimeters. Next, you're going to cut a piece of the 20 gauge half round. I'm cutting about 3 feet for my binder wire. And I'm going to go ahead and put the two ends together and put a soft bend in the middle. Make sure the flat part of the wire is on the inside of the bend. Now you're going to cut 4 more pieces of the 20 gauge wire, about the same length as the pieces of 18 gauge square. Now straighten out the frame wires, which are the 18 gauge square wires. All right, you're almost halfway there. Next, we've got to measure the frame wires and mark the middle point. And when you're doing this part, be sure not to open up any portals. Okay, if you've made it this far, that means you did not open up any portals, and you can go ahead and transfer that line onto the other frame wires. Go ahead and repeat that process for the short pieces of 20 gauge half round that you've cut. Now for this part, you don't have to use a ring clamp. You can just use tape, or you can pinch the frame wires between your fingers, whatever you want to do. But basically, you're going to stabilize the frame wires and make sure they are all aligned as far as the center mark goes and sitting flush relative to one another. Also, I forgot to mention that we will be needing some stones. So I'm using 6mm by 4mm ovular black onyx cabochons. And right here, I am getting a good mental gauge of where I want the stone to sit. And I will make 2 little marks about 1mm outside of where the stone sits. And you want to wrap your seat with barbed wire. I'm just joking. Don't use barbed wire. No, but seriously, we will be wrapping the seat of the stone with the 3-foot piece of 20 gauge half round that you cut. Also, the lengths of these wires that I'm telling you to cut, they're pretty much arbitrary. You're going to have to figure out how much wire you need for, I don't know what project you're working on. You're trying to do a specific thing. I'm cutting my frame wires at 9 inches or so, in case I want to make this to a bracelet or something later on. And with the binder wire, I generally cut those at around 3 feet, because any more than that and it's really difficult to work with, because the wire just flips all around and smacks you in the face and all that stuff. And any less than that, and you risk basically running out of wire before you finish your project. And I can show you what to do if that happens at some point too. But as you may have noticed, what I'm doing here is I'm starting to the left of the center line about 4 or 5mm, maybe a 1/4 inch, and wrapping in one direction until I get to both of the lines that I made. This process is fairly similar to making a ring band, but there are some differences that I will get to in a minute. Also, for this kind of setting, you don't need oval-shaped stones. You can use round stones, round cabochons. I would not use faceted stones for this unless they are flat-backed. Also, with the dimensions, given the size of the wires used for the frame, I would not go any wider than 4mm as far as the stone goes. But if you wanted to use this method for larger stones, you just add more frame wires, and then you probably would want to go up a gauge or two in the half round retainer wires that you're using, just as long as you make sure that all the wire you use is dead soft. Also, a lot of times there's not really a standard name for some of these settings. So, I mean, I just call this stuff like what I've heard it called before, like certain kinds of settings or whatever. And so I've heard this called a bridge setting. So it makes sense to me. I like the way it sounds, whatever. The retainer wires look like a bridge going over the stone. So it makes sense to me. But if you have another name for it, feel free to leave it below in the comments. So like I said, you might not have 6mm by 4mm cabochons. You might have 4mm round cabochons. Either way, whenever you measure out for the seat, which is where the stone will sit, and that's that flat section that's wrapped right there. Basically, you want the seat to be 1mm wider than the stone on both sides. So I've got a 6mm tall stone, so the seat for the stone is 8mm wide. And luckily 18 gauge wire is luckily 20 gauge wire is about 1mm wide, so it makes it easy to measure. So, but if you're using 4mm round stones, you're going to want your seat to be wrapped at 6 millimeters. Okay, once the seat for the stone is wrapped, it's time to add the retainer wires. So go ahead and pinch those in your fingers and line them up flat side down. And once they're all lined up, I like to put a little bend in the end, and that allows me to slip it underneath this binder wire without any lubrication. Anyway, you're gonna have to finagle it and finesse it and move the wires around here and there. And like I said earlier, you might want to use some tape or some kind of clamp or whatever. I just usually pinch the wires with my fingers because that's just the way I am. Anyway, once they're sitting flat against the frame, you can go ahead and wrap them twice with the binder wire. Make sure you flatten the wire each time you wrap. Anyway, you wrap the binder wire around the retainer wires and the frame wires, obviously, twice, and then you flatten it all out and you stop. And then what you're gonna do is you're gonna take the retainer wires and you are going to fold them back toward you at a 90-degree angle away from the frame. Now, as you see, I spread the retainer wires apart into a V shape, but it might be easier for you to keep them parallel. And then once the stone is actually set, you can manipulate the retainer wires around the stone and put them in a different shape and tighten them up a little bit. And I'll show you how to do that here in a minute. All right, now it's time to add the stones to the mix. Okay, for this next step, you're gonna need some baling pliers or some round nose pliers. I've got both, but I'm using my baling pliers because the mandrels on those are more parallel and they don't taper. So basically right here, I am sort of gauging the size of the stone and trying to figure out which mandrel I need to use. And I decided to use the middle one there because it's got the same basic dimensions as the stone. And so I go ahead and bend the retainer wires over using the mandrel pliers and create this shape like this. And so you should have something that looks kind of like this. So now you can go ahead and gently push the retainer wires toward the frame. As you can see, there's a slight S-curve in the retainer wires on the left, but you can actually correct that once the stone gets put in place, which is actually the next step. So I'll go ahead and take a stone and very carefully slip it behind the retainer wires. We're basically just testing the fit. Make sure to hold it from both sides so it doesn't slip out. Also, if you've gotten this far and you're still watching, thank you so much. You're the reason I'm here. At this point, you can go ahead and fold the binder wire over the top of the retainer wires to sort of trap them in place, but don't wrap it all the way around. Just fold it over the top and leave it there. And at this point, you can go ahead and slip the stone back into the setting and make sure it's lining up properly and facing the right direction. Be sure to support it with your fingers so it doesn't slip out. And I'm putting gentle pressure on the top side of it as well to basically keep the retainer wires as close to the stone as possible. And then I go ahead and wrap the binder wire around tightly and then flatten it out and then wrap it one more time and then flatten that out. And I always like to end the wrap on the back side of the frame. And so that's what I'm doing here. So you see there's two, I wrap twice and then I don't continue wrapping once it gets to the back side of the frame. So you should have something that looks like this. And that is a single bridge setting. Like I said earlier, I don't know if you call this something else, but that's just what I call it. And once you get to this point, you're gonna want to retainer wires around the stone to make it, you want to widen it out a little bit and so you can actually see the stone. And also you want to take and pinch both of the retainer wires in your other finger and sort of pull as you're pressing down on the stone with your thumb. You sort of like yank on the retainer wires a little bit and that will tighten them up and it will also mold them around the stone a little better so the stone doesn't slip out. And then once you do that, you get them all nice and tight. You bend them back at a 90-degree angle and that sort of locks it in place and keeps it from loosening up. Granted, you still have the other side that you haven't worked with yet and it's still flat, so you're gonna have to tighten it from that side as well once you turn it around, because remember, this stone is in the middle. So if you want to put more stones on either side, you got to do the same process, but turn it around and go the other way. So basically that is the entire process of making a bridge setting. And to add more to your frame, you just repeat that same process over and over, kind of like making the ring band, where you just repeat the same steps over and over until you get the desired length or whatever. And so that's what you do here. And I made 5 settings in a row. This is what that looks like. Please let me know in the comments if you think I can improve these tutorials in any way, shape, or form. Also, if you feel like you are struggling in one area or another, you can't get something down just right, feel free to post pictures of your work and what you're struggling with, and I will give you an honest answer. And I will honestly critique your work and try to figure out how we can help you. So once you have your stones all set, you can slightly bend the frame. I wouldn't bend it too much, and notice it likes to bend more in between the stones, because where the stone is sitting, it gets really tight right there, and so the wire doesn't like to bend. Anyway, there's that. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. I hope you learned something. So that's it for this one. Thank you for watching. Be sure to subscribe, follow, share, comment, tell me about your dog, any of that cool stuff. I appreciate you all. Please have a great day.